Good morning, everyone. We are going to continue looking at how many styles challenge tradition and see the influence of Cubism that was invented by Braque and Picasso basically at the same time. There's a little bit of um, contention about who really invented it. Probably Ladies of Avignon is probably the first real Cubist painting, but Braque and Picasso were really working on that style together in their separate studios, and then seeing each other's work. So we're going to be in Study Guide 112, and the plan for e-learning tomorrow is to have discussion questions on 111 and 112 before we have school off on Friday for a religious holiday. So let's go ahead and begin. So the first group that we're going to look at is called Der Blau Reiter. And so from the language, it might show you that it was primarily a Germanic style coming from the region that we now consider to be Germany today, the places that speak German. And so not all of the artists happen to be German. Probably the best known artist that we have is Kandinsky, and he actually was Russian. But this group was not as organized as the Bridge or Die Bruch was. And they worked together for only about 4 years. They would often show their work. You can see that this ended in 1914, so with World War I, pretty much put an end to this group of artists working together. And the name Der Blaue Reiter actually comes from a painting. It's actually this one in the very center here called The Blue Reiter by Kandinsky. And this was very much inspired by Fauvism. So there was an emphasis on how color can be expressive, how it can convey mood and meaning. And this led to a lot of use of symbolic color. But also many artists like Kandinsky were moving into non-objective or pure forms of art. So when you look at a work like this one on the left by Kandinsky, it's harder to be able to tell recognizable imagery. It doesn't mean that it disappears entirely. I can still see a boat, right? So you see this shape that I'm circling here, a boat with an oar. Sometimes you can see things like rolling hills and trees and landscape, as well as other things like maybe buildings. We do have some recognizable, but there is a move towards pure abstraction and non-objective art during this time period as well. So the first artist that we have, it's so funny how those names disappear from you, is Franz Marc, and he's known for doing a lot of imagery of animals. And so he's got his horses, and he thought of color as being very symbolic. He saw blue as very masculine color, yellow as a very feminine color, red is a very powerful color. So you see his use of color is very vivid, is very rich, it's very Fauvist. Sometimes the brushstroke is a little bit more visible, sometimes it's more refined. So this is kind of leading us to Kandinsky's work. And so Kandinsky's brushstroke was much more visible and more evident. And so he has a lot of his early paintings that are very much kind of in the vein of symbolist or expressionist, where you see individual brushstroke, you see elements of linear elements like line, kind of outlining. You can see how he is very much inspired by the post-impressionists in Japanese art and so on. So this is kind of an odd painting. In actuality, this one is actually turned on its side. So supposedly, when he was painting this landscape, or a landscape very similar to this, he had placed it on an easel sideways or upside down. And when he looked at it, he found it very compelling. And so that led him to kind of moving towards more of a pure abstraction, or moving to a more non-representational form of art. So how can line and color and brushstroke convey emotion rather than just a literal interpretation of what something looks like. It's more about that sort of feeling. So that leads us to improvisation number 28 by Vasily Kandinsky. And so when you look at his artwork, how does his work seem to be inspired by Fauvist? You can see the evident use of line, so a strong sort of black sort of contour line that we see here in like the fish tank by Matisse. You see color that's really rich and vivid. It's almost like it comes right out of the tube. He tended to use a lot of primary colors, so reds, blues, yellows, and then would sometimes mix for secondary colors like oranges and greens. There's a lot of vivid sort of brush stroke, and so you can see the marks of the artist. So we're going to go ahead and watch this video together, and we're going to be thinking about how the image relates to music, how the imagery is composed. So we want to be looking at how it's arranged. We want to describe what we see if we recognize anything, and what's the possible meaning.
At the Solomon Art Guggenheim Museum in New York City, Vasily Kandinsky. This is improvisation number 28, second version. It's interesting to start off by thinking about a title, because it's not the title of something that's being represented. It's the kind of notation that a composer uses.
Right. Normally in art history, we have stories from the Bible, from history, or mythology, or landscapes that have been taken place. But here we have improvisation, which is the kind of musical composition. So the immediate question is, why is Kandinsky doing that?
Because he's composing here. He's composing with form. It's a still in the story.
But he's clearly trying to associate painting with music, to suggest that, like music, painting can signify, it can mean things, it can take us places without representing anything concrete.
It's a clear color. This idea, which is called synesthesia, is something that's very interesting. The idea that there can be crossing of senses.
So looking at this, he may have wanted us to actually hear something. And in fact, we know that Kandinsky was very influenced by Arnold Schoenberg, a turn-of-the-century composer, who was jettisoning the familiar Western harmonies to create a new kind of difficult atonal music for the beginning of the 20th century. And I see something atonal, something difficult.
What would this painting sound like? For me, it would sound like a cacophony. It would sound like chaos. It would sound like a very dangerous, but also brilliant moment.
We have brilliant color, a hazy atmosphere in which that color comes. We have these black diagonal lines that crisscross with each other that almost feel like weapons moving through space.
And it's appropriate that the analogy of drawings were war. This is 1912. It's just 2 years before the First World War begins. And early 20th century Russian history is filled with political events.
We're clearly on the verge of abstraction. And in fact, when we first look at this painting, it looks entirely abstract. That is, we don't immediately recognize the things of the world. But this isn't what we would call a completely abstract painting.
Right, so one might not call this painting an abstract painting, but call it an abstracted painting.
So therefore, we should still be able to recognize some elements of the natural world.
Kandinsky was concerned that if we could recognize things too clearly, that our conscious minds would take over the interpretation, and we would close off our emotional ability to respond to the pure color and form.
In the upper right, I seem to see a mountain with some buildings on it, maybe with chimney stacks, or perhaps a church on a hill. An ideal city, kind of heavenly Jerusalem.
Kandinsky was deeply influenced by biblical imagery, and so even though this is a tremendously modern painting, it is still rooted in this ancient tradition of fact, art historians have looked at these paintings as a kind of representation of an apocalypse, of a moment when the sins of the world are going to be washed away. In the lower left, you have a great flood. You have a wave, this idea of the way in which God in the Old Testament had wiped man from the earth except for Noah and his family.
Just above that wave, cannons are being fired. The atmospheric effect almost reads like the smoke on a battlefield.
Down at the bottom, art historians sometimes recognize the manes and the arcs of the necks of horses, and we know that Kandinsky is really interested throughout his career in the idea of the horse and rider, symbolizing a number of different things, having overlapping meanings, referencing the whole horseman of the apocalypse, but also the idea of redemption. This was also utopia, the idea that we could wash away the old world, a world that was about to be destroyed not only by Russian pollution, but also by the First World War. Kandinsky at this moment was convinced that he could help lead that, at least in the visual realm.
Many artists at this time, the early 20th century, had a sense that the artist could play an important role in the new civilization that was going to emerge in the 20th century.
So here we have a painting that is using color in a radically new way. This is color for its own sake, not to mimic, not to describe. We have line that is being used for its own sake, lines that is abstractly moving across the surface to create a sense of rhythm, to create a sense of staccato, musicality in this painting. It is absolutely new.
So let's go ahead and look at some of the questions that we had. So if you notice, one of the things that we saw on many of his titles is that he would use words that you would associate with music: composition, improvisation, symphony. He uses a lot of those sort of words. And so he likened painting to music. And so when he was influenced by Schoenberg, they showed an image of him actually was friends with him. Atonal music, I'm not sure how much of you are familiar with that. So let's go ahead and just listen to a little bit of it. That's probably enough of it so that you can kind of get the idea. So when we are looking at a painting like this, you can see how he would be very much influenced by that atonal music, that idea of contrast, a lack of like there's harmony, but it has a lot of contradictions. It has a lot of visible brushstroke. It has a lot of crisscrossing sort of patterns. This idea that you don't have to have a beautiful blended surface, that you don't need to have it be all harmonious and all like flowing and like beautiful, that it can be disjointed, that it can have some sharp edges, it can have some soft pauses, it can have some long linear elements, but then also some really quick sort of elements to it. All of these things are very much inspired by music and this new sort of modernist thought. When you also look at his work, they talked a lot about how it's very abstracted. So you can see a big time distortion of reality. But there are some things that have kind of a biblical kind of context to it. So the subject matter, even though it's called improvisation number 28, probably has some sort of religious connotation, a holy city on a hill, the idea of flood, maybe apocalypse, this kind of coming of, return, an ending of like the return of the Savior or the ending of the world was very much on the forefront as things were radically changing, especially in Europe of the day. We can look at some other examples of his work. He has a lot of reoccurring sort of motifs of like that ship and oar. Like I said, he has lots of cannons and whatnot as well. You can see that how his work starts to really sort of distort. And later pieces of his were very much based on geometry and geometric shapes, lines, and colors. And you can see how his work was very much inspired by things like Cubism, right? Kind of almost like a synthetic and an analytical combined. Another movement during this time period was taking place in Germany, and this was called the Bauhaus. Bauhaus was highly influential in design during the day, graphic design, design of household, like objects, like things that you would purchase, like furniture, dinnerware, that sort of thing. This was um, founded by Walter Gropius. Gropius was a designer as well as an architect who eventually moves to the United States during World War II. After the Bauhaus was debunked or disbanded, I had a lot of Jewish teachers, and so many people fled to the United States. They were a follower of what we call the arts and craft movement. So arts and craft movement was like highly refined objects based on post-industrial revolution. So, we don't want to have cheap things. We want to have things that are really made well. Westwood would be a good example when we looked at that example of pottery. This idea that we want some things that are really great examples of craftsmanship and whatnot. So here is an example of a very sort of sleek, modern tea set, tapestries. This is Albers. This is a female textile artist. Her husband was Joseph Albers. He was a very famous painter in the 1950s in the United States. Here's the architecture in Dessau. It's very clean, very modern. You see lots of windows. It's almost like it's a factory for art. Allowed a lot more flexibility in the interior space so that you could have small itty-bitty little studios, or you could remove walls really easily to allow for big exhibition spaces. But of course, lots of nice natural light sort of flooding in. So this was designed by Gropius. And that kind of leads to an international style of architecture. So here's the Bauhaus in Berlin. Gropius designed this factory building. And so it doesn't look like much, but you have to consider that this is pretty clean and pristine for a factory. And so it has a lot of windows to allow natural light so people can see what they're working on. It doesn't have corner posts. You see how the windows kind of wrap around. We saw that in the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright for a house, but to have a factory that doesn't have that corner post is pretty revolutionary. Coming from kind of this pure aesthetic, we also have Stijl. This is a Scandinavian style, and so we're going to be looking at Mondrian for this. This was a non-representational abstract style founded in Holland, where art was based on purism and simplicity. They sought for universal harmonies in this concept of visual balance. It's based on the theories of Schumacher, who was trying to find how you have balance with opposing forces. And so objects were often reduced to basic colors, values, lines, shapes, and the aesthetic was based on pure composition, so organization of visual elements. So here's some early work by Mondrian, once again, very much inspired by the post-impressionists, landscapes going out, showing visible brushstroke, using vivid color. So how is Stijl similar to Cubism? It has a kind of sense of geometry to it and that analyzing of space and color. So what does Mondrian reduce his images to? This painting that is in a square shape has a series of rectangles and black lines. And the colors that he used are our primary colors, so our purest, most simplistic colors. So we have our yellow, our red, and our blue. And he visually balances those things by contrasting cool colors with warm colors. He only uses white and black to kind of break up those spaces. So that leads us to composition red, blue, and yellow by Mondrian. This is a great example of those opposing forces. So when you look at it, how is he creating visual balance? What is he balancing? Let's start first with where your eye goes. What's the first thing you notice? I don't think you can pass up that big giant red square, right? So your eye goes to the red square and he balances that red warm color with that small blue rectangle in the bottom left. And then your eye visually gets moved to the itty bitty little yellow rectangle on the far right corner. So he's creating a triangle composition even though he's only using rectangles. And then he breaks up the space visually with white rectangles with broad black strokes. So this idea of balance of opposing forces, balancing big versus small, warm versus cool, and light versus dark with the white and the black. It's said that Mondrian was such a purist that in his native Holland, where tulips were so prevalent, he would paint the stems of the tulips in his house. So he'd get rid of the green and he'd paint them black. He spent some time in New York City, and this is called Broadway Boogie Woogie. You see the elimination of black, but what do you think he was inspired by called Broadway Boogie Woogie? He was inspired by the jazz music that he had encountered in the bars and the nightclubs. He was inspired by the street lights and the activity of the nightlife of New York City. This is Ben Nicholson, who also worked in the Stijl style. You can see that he's using some different colors, but once again, just the balance of very simple sort of shapes of rectangles and circles, muted colors, very little pure color. He tended to work in things like collage and mixed media. And then this is Schönbacher. This is a piece of architecture that basically looks like a Mondrian painting that you could live in. And so you can see those balance of rectilinear shapes. Reminds me a lot of the work of Frank Lloyd Wright, where we have a balance of horizontal and vertical elements to it. You can even see that he's using pops of color in I-beams, where he uses red and yellow and blue and black. The interior is quite interesting. So it has, like the Bauhaus, movable walls. And so a lot of these spaces were used for multiple purposes, kind of this modern sort of living. And so in this space here, you could work and sleep. So it's a combination office and bedroom. You could also do that in this room. The living room was used for dining as well. So you could move rooms as you needed them. So the black lines are structural walls. Those gray lines are all these walls that you could move in and out, kind of like slider doors. There's like Japanese screen doors. We're going to go to Russia for now. And there's two different art movements taking place before World War I in Russia. And this is the time of the revolution. So suprematism was a Russian movement based on non-objectivity, which basically means a severe abstraction, characterized by highly simplified, non-representational works, very much like Mondrian, based on rectilinear units of color. Some works don't have color at all. And it was based on plastic values, which means only composition. So we're not thinking about trees, we're thinking about just organization of space. Supremacy comes from the supremacy of pure feeling in creative art. So this is Malevich. And so Malevich would just take simple shapes and paint them on the canvas. So here we have red on white, black, yellow, and red on white, black on white. And then we have white on white. And so this is at the MoMA, and this is probably his best known piece. This is one of those paintings that people are like, I could do that. For him, it was really about this pure sort of aesthetic. And if you pay really close attention to it, white on white is not the same white on the same white. If you've ever painted a room and gone into um, a Home Depot or Lowe's, you know that there are many variations of a white. So he takes a white square, tilts it on the side, and paints it on a white canvas. Feel free to look at Art Smart History if you're really interested in this. This is a good example of Russian constructivism. Constructivism was based on synthetic cubism. It constructed forms. They used a lot of innovative materials, things like concrete, metal, glass, plaster, asphalt, wire, and wood, a lot of industrial materials. And they thought that those materials would bring their own meaning. So they come with their own natural color, they come with their own natural form, and then their usage creates meaning. And so this is by Tatlin, and this is called The Monument to the Third International. This is actually a model for a building that he wanted to build. And so this was a building which would have public spaces at the very, very bottom. Then it would have governmental spaces kind of in the middle. And then at the very top, it would have broadcasting facilities so that the message of the government could be broadcast to all of the people. His envision was that this would be a building that would rotate and spiral. So it actually would be like a giant machine that would work. This should be known that suprematism and constructivism was not fully embraced by the common everyday people, and then eventually falls out of favor even with the rise of communism, because it was too cerebral. It was too tailored to the avant-garde. And so this building was never built. But a lot of things that were built is this is like a reading room for a factory where people could read propaganda made by the Russian government, in the Soviet government, I should say, in order to promote the new communist regime and the teachings of Stalin and Lenin. But you can see with a lot of constructivist sculpture that it had a sense of installation where they transformed spaces. The art of the people was what we call Russian social realism. And this is a style, social realism, that we see in many countries. This is kind of the art of the common everyday people. And so this is very much like we saw when we looked at the image of General Mao in China, where it was very recognizable. People could understand. There was images of the common everyday people. That leads us to the imagery of Steponova. And so this was made by Varvara Steponova, and she used a technique that we call photo montage. The artwork that we have in the 250 is also an example of photo montage. So today, we're really used to things like Photoshop, and we can take digital media and we can compose it, we can cut and paste and use interesting filters. But before that, people used to do things by hand. So photo montage was basically cutting apart photos and combining them together with text and flat color in an interesting, innovative way. So that leads us to our last image today, which is called the illustration from the results of the first 5-year plan. And so normally we do a smart history article on this. And so if you haven't done your study guide, you might want to fill in your questions 11 through 18. But I did go through and kind of break this apart because this was normally a class activity that we would do. So let's first look at how this work is a work of propaganda and what it exactly promotes and how. So that's a lot. So let's break it apart into smaller parts. So just a little bit of context. Varvanova was a contributor to a magazine, so a Soviet magazine called the USSR in Construction. And so this was a magazine that really started to promote industrialization in the Soviet Union under the reign of Stalin. And it wasn't necessarily just made for people who lived in the Soviet Union. It was also made for expatriates who had moved out, as well as for other countries. So other countries like Great Britain and the United States would understand that the Soviet Union was a major global economy, that it was doing really well. And so it was a way of promoting themselves and promoting communism. It really focused on industrialization, and so showing the USSR as a leader in industrialization, education, agriculture, as well as sports and leisure. So a lot of it was for people to be able to see the accomplishments of communism and the accomplishments of Stalin. So this work was made to illustrate the success of the first 5-year plan. This was an initiative started by Stalin in 1928. And so this plan was a way of trying to grow the Soviet Union, trying to grow its economy, and to accelerate industrialization. So during this time, a lot of factories were built, a lot of housing was built. There was a promotion of workers. So going back and thinking of that Constructivist union hall where people are reading, keeping the people informed, keeping the people happy. And so the goal of it was to have things like collective farming, to create a military that was powerful, that could compete, as well as to increase steel production. So these are all things that are kind of lead it into being a major power when we think about World War II. By the end of the first 5 years in 1933, the USSR had become a very powerful industrial power. Some of those numbers were inflated. So a lot of historians don't think that it was as powerful as it actually was. It was just perceived to be as powerful. So let's look at how Steponova conveys her messages in this photo montage. So when we look at it, she's really reducing it to very simple colors and values. So the photos and the images, Lenin, right, a major leader and teacher of communism, is in black and white. There's many images of crowds of people in black and white, and then sepia tone, which is a kind of a brown, black and white, a monochromatic photo. And then, of course, she uses pops of red and white and black. So she's really reducing it to very simple values and colors. She also alternates between black and white and pops of color. And of course, where does the color red come from? Of course, it comes from the Soviet Union's flag, and then, of course, now the Russian flag. She also creates contrast by the size of the people. So we have a gigantic head of Lenin, and then we have electrical wires coming and leading your eye down to these really large broadcasting horns. And then, of course, we see the CCCP, which is the initials for the USSR in Russian. And we see itty bitty little people. So those commons for everyday people. So we have the contrast of large figures and small figures, dense crowds, more open spaces. She really tries to activate it with those senses of red and those large contrasts between the black and the white, the large and the small. So I think that's it for today. I hope you guys have a good day today, and let me know if you need anything through Remind or email.